We would like to begin. There are 2 items on the agenda, and so first we're going to honor the wonderful work of Mark Maurer, and then I'm going to say a few things about our field after he says a few things about our field, and then the new president will, actually 3 items on our agenda. We will have a few words from our incoming president. So that's the plan. I'm going to put on my granny glasses so that I can actually read my notes. One of the great honors that comes to an ASC president is the opportunity to recognize distinguished contributions to justice. So it was my immediate response when I thought about that I wanted to honor Mark Maurer of the Sentencing Project, and actually before that work with the American Friends Service Committee and many other worthy organizations. For those of you who've been in Antarctica with Betsy, let me just talk to you a little bit about the work of the Sentencing Committee and more specifically the work of Mark Maurer. Most importantly, I think Mark, and I want to get the year right on this, many people had the numbers available to them, but it was Mark in 1990 who wrote a paper, Young Black Men and the Criminal Justice System. And what that report did, crucially and importantly, was document an astonishing statistic. 1 out of every 4 young Black American males was under some form of correctional supervision on any given day. It was an astonishing number. It changed the national conversation around race and the criminal justice system. And we went away from that soul-deadening sentencing research to an important discussion about racism in our systems. He continued the conversation about race in a very important book that he wrote, and I just want to make sure I get this right, Race to Incarcerate, which was written in 1999. Michelle Alexander acknowledged the debt that she owed to that book in her early work as a civil rights lawyer, and of course she would go on to write a very important book in her own right about racism in the criminal justice system and the new Jim Crow. So Mark continues to do very important work around felony disenfranchisement, and he is just a stellar human being and scholar, and so it's my pleasure again to give you, Mark, the President's Award for Distinguished Contributions to Justice. Congratulations. Bravo. Thank you.
Well, this is a real treat. First, my thanks to my longtime dear friend and colleague, Mida, who at various times has been my mentor, my colleague, my co-editor, my friend, and many other things along the way. And we've been on this long journey together, and it's just been a real pleasure for me to share that with her. My thanks to so many of you in the audience today. You all know who you are, all the people in the ASC with whom I've collaborated, from whom I've learned so much, from who've become good personal friends over the years. This is very hard work and very difficult issues we're all talking about, and it means a lot to have all these connections, and I really, truly appreciate that. I have to say, too, Mita's very kind introduction, I've come to appreciate the importance of getting the details right in that. Mita mentioned my book, Race to Incarcerate, and when the book was first published, I was giving a talk at one of the bookstores in Washington, and a newsletter went out promoting the talk. It said Mark Maurer will speak about his new book, Race to Incinerate. But I talked about prisons anyway. Right. So I want to just offer a few reflections on what this award has meant to me in thinking about contributions to justice. And it seems to me it's very difficult as we, those of us engaged in research and education advocacy, how does one measure success? How does one measure contributions? I began this work in 1973. As we all know now, 1973 was the first year of the historic rise in the prison population that we now call mass incarceration. There are about 300,000 people in prison and jail that year. And I've had a career devoted to reducing the use of incarceration. And I can say near the end of my career now, there are now more than 2 million people behind bars. So one could say my career has been a big failure if that's the measure that we're taking, but I try not to take it personally. I think there are many larger forces at work, and unfortunately, we can document very similar trends in other areas of social policy, immigration, social welfare, race relations. This has been a unique period in many respects in our country's history. But it is true that today and over the last decade, the public political environment on criminal justice policy and public safety clearly is starting to shift. There's now a growing critique of mass incarceration coming from many different quarters. One of the more prominent ways we can see this is if we look at the candidates for the Democratic primary for presidential nomination, virtually all of whom have submitted fairly detailed proposals for how they would end mass incarceration. And we can critique which ones we like the best or so, but this is a pretty dramatic shift from not very long ago when both Democrats and Republicans were trying to outdo each other on how tough they could be. So it seems like we're starting to see some shifts here. My wife often says to me, thinking about the climate and things like that, you've been saying the same thing now for 40 years. And I like to think I've been saying it in a little more sophisticated way over time, but she's basically correct. And it's taken 40 years, and all of you know that and have been doing your own work. These things take time to penetrate in the public consciousness. It's also the case, of course, that it's our collective research that has helped to make the case, but there's a groundswell from the bottom that's rising up to demand change. So as we see larger numbers of young people, formerly incarcerated activists, Black Lives Matter, and other movements creating this demand for change, policymakers, political candidates are beginning to respond to this demand. So what does this mean for criminology today and what we should be working on? As I think about my career and the issues I've worked on and the kind of work I've done, I like to think I have some creativity, but much of my work has actually focused on trying to document things that we know already but have not received the attention that they deserve given how profound the problems are. So when we started doing work on race and justice issues in the early 1990s, it's not as if I was the first person to discover the problem of racism in the justice system. But I was able to put some numbers together on and to offer an analysis of where I thought these numbers came from and what the consequences might be. Later in the late 1990s, we started working on the issue of felony disenfranchisement. And, there, I'll confess, I'd been working for 2 decades or so on these issues. I had a vague sense that when you had a felony conviction, you lost your right to vote, and it turned out it's far more complex than that. It depends on where you are and who your governor is and a million other things like that. But we started to cobble together some data and try to provide some estimates. Over a period of time, we've had a wonderful collaboration with Chris Hugan and his colleagues, so now we have some very sophisticated estimates of the impact of these policies. But here too, it was something that's been out there since the time of the founding of this country, and we collectively have not paid any significant attention to that problem. We find also, as I see from my vantage point in Washington, and we try to work with policymakers there and around the country, things that we all know, and in many ways we've known in criminology for 100 years, are not well known by much of America. We still hear judges and legislators talking about tough sentences because they want to send a message to somebody or so. Send a message. We've known for a very long time, if you want to deter people from committing crimes, it's the certainty of punishment, not the severity of punishment, and so that message is not going to be heard in any significant ways, but it's not widely understood, certainly, and we need to find ways to get that across to people. Similarly, the Sentencing Project, we're now heavily engaged, we have been for some years, in looking at long-term incarceration and life imprisonment. Along with my colleague Ashley Nellis, we published a book last year, The Meaning of Life, that looks at these issues. And much of the rationale for these long sentences has been around incapacitation, the idea that these are people who've done terrible things, and if we keep them locked up forever, we will be safer. And here too, we've known for 100 years, but we know in very sophisticated ways now, people age out of the high crime rate years, right? The numbers go up in the teen years and the early 20s, but then come down fairly rapidly. And so it leads to diminishing returns for public safety. It's very counterproductive in how we use our resources. I think it's quite possible to explain this to policymakers and the public. Anyone who's ever had a teenage kid who then grows up and matures by the time they're 25 or 30 can understand this, but it's not widely known, I don't think. So we need to look at how to get those messages across too. So I think, yes, we need to be doing new research on new issues, and the only good thing you can say about mass incarceration is that it's given us a wealth of opportunities to look at all the various ripple effects and destructive effects it's had on communities and our country, broadly speaking. So we need to trace those effects, but we also need to keep an eye on how to communicate what we know and how do we get that across in ways that are useful, in ways that resonate with the public and with policymakers. I think there's long been a lot of research, public opinion research, that demonstrates that people don't necessarily have much faith that prison is making better people, but in the absence of any significant alternative that makes sense to them, prison becomes the default option, and that's what people are likely to go for. Let me just close with a personal story that I think gets at issues of social change, and it takes us back to the beginning of my career, back in 1973, when I did begin working on these issues. That was a time I was in graduate school in social work at the University of Michigan, needed to do a field placement. And so I went and started working with the Office of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker Social Justice Organization. That's how I know Mita and her husband through those years. And they were working on the issue of money bail. And the way they were approaching it was to start a community bail fund. So we went around to some local churches, and they each pitched in a little bit of money, and we had a pot of funds we could use, and our strategy was to post money bail to get people out of jail in order to prove that money bail was a bad idea. So it was a little convoluted. We didn't have very much money, so we did it for one person at a time. When they showed up, the money would come back and we would do it for another person. And by the time we got to defendant number 6, I think, all of a sudden he didn't show up in court, and all of a sudden we realized we weren't do-gooders, we were the bail bondsmen, and what do we do now? So that was a little challenge for us. And it's taken, obviously, nearly a half century for the issue of money bail to finally come to the fore now, and we're far from having achieved success, but little by little we're starting to see that start to crumble away long after it should have. It wasn't until sometimes later, though, that I came to understand that my family actually had a very strong connection that's important to me on the issue of money bail, of all things. So my parents grew up in New York City in immigrant households and came of age in the 1930s, and independently each of them became politically active in causes of the day. And so a group they were involved with one Sunday afternoon went to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and they were going to sell flowers for peace to raise money for some cause then. So they started selling the flowers, and a police officer came up to my father and said, "Do you have a permit to sell flowers?" And he said no, so they promptly arrested him, started taking him down to the station. My mother didn't know him very well, but she saw he was in trouble, so she tagged along to the station, where they then proceeded to set his bail at $5 in order to get out. And of course, neither of them had $5. That was a lot of money in their household. So my mother ran out, she ran to her family, his family, cobbled together $5, bring it down to the station, and she was able to bail him out. And I guess he thought that, well, if she's willing to go to the trouble of bailing me out, I should pay attention to her. So, and one thing led to another. But if you think about it, if we had been successful at the time before that in eliminating money bail, they would have done a risk assessment of my father and determined that he was a good risk to appear in court. They wouldn't have set a money bail, and I wouldn't be here today probably. So all of which is to say that, social change is a complicated process. It's messy. We can't always predict where it's going to go. There are unexpected outcomes along the way. It seems to me we need to have a vision for a better society, a better public safety policy, a better way to heal communities. It's not going to be easy to move along at various points of the way. We're living difficult times now, of course, but we need both a vision, a strategy, but also think about how do we build the incremental steps and the incremental coalitions that can help get us there. And that's what we've tried to do with the Sentencing Project over the last several decades. We're proud of what we've been able to achieve along with many of our colleagues. We still all have a long way to go in achieving that vision, but I think we have some idea of how to get there, and I think we're collectively moving forward. So once again, I'm so grateful. This is such an honor for me to be in a place like this with colleagues like this, and coming from my favorite president of the ASC, actually, to be perfectly honest. It's a real treat, and thank you very much.
I finally won a talent contest. That's wonderful. Let's see, I'm going to ask for help to get my slides up from Robert. Oh, look at that. Now we're going to talk about sexism. I have a lot of direct experience with this, so it can be a personal journey. In fact, what I wanted to do was make you all hop into the Wayback Machine with me. And wait, I've got to advance the slide here. Oops, there we are. When I was in college, I wanted to show the social terrain that basically created the social activist and the academic. So, and my sister's here too, and it was the reality for her as well. When we were graduating from Whitman College, 4.5% of law school admissions were female. A whopping 7% of medical school admissions were female. So we knew effectively that those doors were closed to us. This picture, by the way, is the picture of Patsy Takemoto Mink's law school class. She's the only woman in the class. I also wanted to say that I knew that unlike Bill Clinton, who graduated the same year from college that I did, I would not be able to apply to be a Rhodes Scholar. So I got into, because I was in Hawaii, Hawaii was the first state to pass women's right to safe and legal abortion. I got involved in abortion decision-making research. That got me to a demographic conference where there was a man up there. I was a graduate student, so I was in the audience listening in reverence. And he was talking about fertility rates and population rates, but mostly fertility rates, and he was using male pronouns. So I'm sitting in the audience listening to this, but because I'm a graduate student, I wait to the break. And I said to him, you know, you were talking about fertility rates, and, you know, I've been studying that too. And why are you not saying she and her? And he said, well, if I said she and her, it would trivialize my research. So I wrote about that in the Criminologist. You can see, I don't know if you can see the date, but that was 1988, and I opened with that story. Well, unlike the problem that demographers have where they have to study women, we can study men. This is the Chicago School. And I wanted to just do a kind of check-in to our inherited legacy here. The theories that we work with come out of this particular city more than any other. And this was where we learned that we should focus as a field not on gender. Nobody paid attention to gender. We normalized male violence. And we don't pay attention to ethnicity because of ecological succession. So the Chicago School's complicated legacy did, in fact, look at urban, this is going to date me, urban subcultures, and it did talk about the characteristics of urban neighborhoods and inequality in the production of crime. I call this the West Side Story syndrome. But it, as I said, conflated race with ethnicity. So criminologists turned away from the study of race, never looked at the legacy of slavery until very, very recently. I still think we're terribly remiss in that treatment. We also paid no attention to girls. This book on the, and I have this book, I'm so proud of myself. I collect old criminology books, among many things that I collect. They normalized male violence, and they completely ignored girls and women. This, for just one example, Shaw and McKay used only male delinquency rates as delinquency rates. So women were literally disappeared from research, but they were not disappeared from the juvenile justice system. So when I started studying that system, I discovered thousands of girls who were being jailed for things like sexual immorality and later running away from home, even though these were supposedly extremely minor offenses. So it wasn't that they overlooked girls and women and nothing bad was happening to girls and women. Terrible things were happening to girls and women, and they were being completely ignored. Okay, what else about gender and crime? Here's a table none of you can read, so just trust me on this. It shows that it's bad to be a woman in science, and I happen to be doing that, so I can say firsthand that this is true. There was one fine study that was done in Sweden of the peer review process, and because of a lawsuit, they were actually able to expose what happens during the peer review process. And after a careful regression analysis of 9 possible variables, including productivity variables like number of journal articles, numbers of publications, journal prestige, they found only 2 variables that were correlated with career success. Being male and knowing a reviewer, okay? This is in the peer review process. And on average, we got a good number out of this study. Women had to be 2.5 times as good as males to be considered good enough to get an award. One other thing that happens, in addition to being a woman scholar, that's problematic. It's worse if you're a feminist. And this is actually from Lee Bowker's work. Lee had an androgynous middle name. He published a lot of traditional criminology with guys like Ron Huff, thinking of you, Ron. But he also published early feminist work on wife battering and violence against women. When he published what he called feminist work, his feminist publication acceptance rate was 54%. When he published non-feminist work, it was 85%. So there's an additional penalty we pay for being feminists. But we go on. Here are I'm the current, Sally's the future, and Karenheimer is the past. So coming into our field, we're doing pretty well in terms of presidents in recent years. However, history matters, and of all the ASC presidents, going back to the formation of our organization, they have been male 87% of the time, and there has been only one person of color, Ruth Peterson. Otherwise, it would have been 100% Caucasian. So the current ASC board, though, to look on a better number, is now 86% female. The cynic in me suggests that these jobs are opening up to women because they're hard work. There are also divisions on people of color and divisions on women in crime, and while I think these are wonderful nurturing spaces for women and people of color, they also reflect the challenges that those groups have experienced. Earlier in this room, Betsy Stanko talked about the formation of the Division on Women in Crime and the central role played by sexual harassment and the early study that we did on sexual harassment, which, as you know, continues to be a problem that haunts this association. My student, Nick Shagnon, and I also did a paper on, brace yourself, I think you can read the title, Racism and Sexism in Our Field. And we looked at a couple of variables. We looked at the membership, the characteristics of our membership. We looked at authorship data from 3 top-tier criminology journals, and we looked at the characteristics of award winners. So here comes the first incomprehensible table. Basically, to nutshell this, the good news is nearly half of our membership is female, 48%. But that said, 80% of the female members of the ASC are white. The figures are slightly more encouraging, but not by much. 70% of male members are white. So we certainly have a race problem in terms of our membership, particularly for women, sad to say. If we look at our top-tier journals, we aggregated the number of males and females that appear as authors in those journals, and 40% of the authors are female. And let me just see, do I have, yeah. Then we looked at gender by first authors, and we found that 60% were male and 90% were white. So that works out to be a lot of white males. Okay, especially when we get to these top-tier journals. In addition, the journals, especially Criminology and Justice Quarterly, publish overwhelmingly quantitative research. And now we go to another area where white males rock. That would be awards. And I'll just pluck one number out of this table. I can send the article to you if you want to see this. I've got my PDF that I send everybody. The Sutherland Award has been awarded to white males basically over 90% of the time. Although I was glad to sit here last night to hear Peggy Giordano give the Sutherland address. So we're trying to change things. Oops, okay, what else are we trying to change? Let's go back. We are trying to address, at our plenaries, I want to thank Lisa Pasco and Vera Lopez, who worked with me on this program, because we tried to take on some of these issues in our plenaries. Internally, we wanted to talk about sexual harassment within ASC, and Walter de Kezereddy chaired a wonderful panel on this topic. Hank Fridella is helping us with issues around LGBTQ members within the society so that they feel comfortable and have a space of their own here. We want to eliminate failures in policing and make policing more accountable, and Kim Rossmo had a great session on investigations and when wrongful investigations occur, how that happens. We have to learn from our mistakes. We have to study the interface between the criminal justice system and immigration and people who are in our country and who are being labeled as criminals for essentially what used to be civil matters and are increasingly, we're talking about criminalized matters. And we had a wonderful session that Vera Lopez helped pull together on the problematic use of the word crimmigration to discuss this. And speaking of Mark Maurer and me, the Chesney-LInd, here's the book we did together, edited together, on issues of the hidden aspects of and punishments that are associated with mass imprisonment. And then finally, this morning, we had a great session on reproductive justice and the need to engage new kinds of discussions around issues of abortion rights and the importance of us doing research on the recriminalization of abortion, which is a process that can happen and is happening. And we have scholars in places like Texas documenting exactly how difficult it is. And we also had a wonderful contribution from Ireland talking about where the Irish actually repealed their restrictive abortion legislation. But I think more broadly, and here's where I get to my favorite slide in the show, we need to understand that abortion rights, that these issues are political issues, not medical issues. And this is a picture of Emma Goldman, and she and Ben Reitman were actually jailed, and they were jailed in Portland, Oregon, Margaret, or they were distributing information about contraception in where I went to high school, a little earlier than when I went to high school, and they were jailed for distributing contraceptive information. But Emma, unlike Margaret Sanger, Emma understood this to be a political issue around women's sexuality and the right that women and men had to control their bodies and to not be in situations where they were forced to carry pregnancies to term that they did not wish to have. So I think we need to recapture that, and with that, I can't, I've got another Emma Goldman quote that we have to end with here. Oh, wait, I'll say the one when she went to jail. While I'm not particularly anxious to go to jail, I should yet be glad to do so if I can thereby add my mite to the importance of birth control and the wiping off of our antiquated laws upon the statute. And then her last quote, the most violent element in society is ignorance. Thank you.